vyākhyātaṃ śravaṇaṃ ghrāṇaṃ rasanaṃ sparśanaṃ manaḥ darśanenaiva jānīyāc chrotṛ-śrotavyakādi ca.
Vyākhyātaṃ śravaṇaṃ ghrāṇaṃ rasanaṃ sparśanaṃ manaḥ darśanenaiva jānīyāc chrotṛ-śrotavyakādi ca. MMK chapter 3 verse 8. One should know that listening, smelling, tasting, touching and thinking are communicated in full by just looking, as also are the listener, the to be listened to, and so on. So this is the concluding verse of chapter 3, and what we've been exploring primarily is the meaning of darśanenaiva, translated here as looking. We got the word darśanenaiva, so that's instrumental, darśanena, by the act of looking, by the act of seeing, and eva, emphatic. So it's suggesting, as I read, the act of looking as a means whereby, and that is, to me, suggestive of this sitting practice itself. We had the same word, just looking back in verse, where do we have darśanenaiva? In verse, so in verse 5 we have the same two words, vyākhyātaṃ and darśanenaiva. So in verse 5 we had by the means of just looking, he is communicated in full, and he in that case is the one who looks, the looker, in other words, the one who practices. So that's verse 5, and in this verse, verse 8, we have vyākhyātaṃ is the act of listening, the act of smelling, ghrāṇaṃ, the act of tasting, rasanaṃ, the act of touching, sparśanaṃ, and the act of thinking, manaḥ. So darśanenaiva in Sanskrit includes the meaning of vision as a sense. Okay, so that meaning is somewhat refuted in this chapter as I read it, because what Nagarjuna is explaining is darshana as a action noun, an act of looking or an act of seeing. So in Chinese, when they translated darśanenaiva, those two possibilities. There's kan, which means to look. So in the Heart Sutra, kanji zaibo satsu gyojin hanya haramitaji, when the bodhisattva, who was jizai, free in kan, looking, reflecting. Kanji zaibo satsu, is bodhisattva, gyojin, practiced, jin, the profound, hanya haramita, prajna, the transcendent virtue of prajna, wisdom. Kanji zaibo satsu gyojin hanya haramita ji shoken goon kaiku. He reflected that the five skandhas are totally empty of their own self-existence. The five constituents that we think of as making up a psychophysical whole are all empty of their own self-existence. So that's one meaning of kan. Again, in Shobogenzo, one chapter is called Kanon, which also refers to the same bodhisattva. Kanon means looking or regarding, beholding sounds. So in fact, avalokātisvara is not originally, doesn't contain the Sanskrit word darshana, but the point remains that darshana, if you look it up in the dictionary, it'd be given as vision, looking, listening, realizing, meeting, view, opinion. So it covers a multitude of sins. But in this verse, darśanenaiva, it suggests darshana as a means whereby. And then so, is it better translated as act of looking or act of seeing? When we just sit in lotus and shut up? Is it an act of looking or is it an act of seeing? That's what we've been exploring in this chapter. And in fact, that might be a good meaning of darshana, to explore. I've been suggesting that real practice, sometimes it's to be the one who sees. Sometimes you make a discovery, you're the discoverer. But primarily, it's an act of exploring, an act of looking. And as just a small example of that, when I'm doing this process of going through it verse by verse, the part I'm always conscious of, or mindful of, if you like that word, is when I say chapter 3, verse 8. For me, that's like shoveling horse manure. It's something I know I can do as practice. I'm looking at the number 3, which is not Sanskrit or not English. It's in fact, it's an Arabic numeral, 3.8. So since I was maybe 2 years old, I could do that. I could look at the number and say 3, chapter 3, verse 8. So I'm looking at the number and I'm listening to myself say it out loud. And there's something perfect about that. You know, I'm going to hit that target nearly every time. I might go wrong with chapter and verse actually, but when I'm saying 3 and 8, it's looking and listening and speaking. There's a kind of what Paul Madahl calls an ear-voice connection. So Paul Madahl was one of my heroes in the developmental work I used to do with children. He was a protege of Alfred Tomaty. Alfred Tomaty was a French ear, nose and throat specialist who, the starting point of his discovery was an opera singer had come to him who'd lost his voice. And Tomaty looked in his right ear and found there was a plug of earwax in the right ear. So he took out the plug of earwax and boom, the opera singer's voice had come back straight away. So this was a big signal to Tomaty that his one principle that he continued to explain through his life after that moment was we sing with our ears. We are only able to produce vocally what we're able to hear. So like another example of that is teaching Japanese people the difference between L and R. In Japanese, if you say lorry, there's no, in Japanese, the character for lo and the character for ri, there's no discrimination between, well, if we say lo and ra, there's no discrimination in Japanese. So Japanese children don't learn to discriminate through the auditory channel between l and r. And because they can't hear the difference, they can't, unless you teach them to hear the difference, they can't speak the difference. So it's no use. I mean, along the way, you can say, look, l, the tongue is l, touch, and r, the tongue's not touching the roof of the mouth. You can explain that to them. the mechanics of how to produce the sound. But in the end, what's really important is hearing it. And so there's an analogous situation in the Alexander work with what Alexander called faulty sensory appreciation. If your task in Zazen primarily is to direct yourself up, and your vestibular sense is faulty, you're just like a Japanese child trying to say red lorry, yellow lorry, who can't hear the difference between L and R. You need somehow to be re-educated so that you can tell where up is. And that's re-education of the vestibular sense. Now, on the surface, the vestibular sense, or the compound sense of proprioception, is represented in this verse by manaḥ, which means mind, or originally, you look in the dictionary, it says thinking. The point I want to make is that if you understand, so let's take the translation done by Sideris and Katz Prize for translating MMK. And this is their rendition of chapter 3, verse 8. One should know that hearing, smelling, tasting, touch, and the inner sense are explained by means of vision, as well as indeed the hearer and what is heard, etc. Okay, so grammatically, only thing to complain about there is their use of indeed, because the eva is not cha eva, it's not as well as indeed. The eva is emphasizing darśanenaiva. So in their translation, when I say by means of vision, they should say by the very means of vision, or by means of vision itself, or just by means of vision. And what they actually said was by means of vision, as well as indeed the hearer and what is heard, etc. So they got the indeed in the wrong place. Apart from that, grammatically, it's fine, and the vocabulary is all fine, except they've used, as a translation of darshana, vision, when it doesn't mean vision, it means the act of looking or the act of seeing. And they translated manaḥ similarly as the inner sense. So hearing, smelling, tasting, that's right, with the ing on the end, but touch should be touching. Sparśanaṃ is a action word. So to convey the sense of the original, I think touching would be better. And then for manaḥ, the inner sense is literal enough. It suggests the compound sense of proprioception centered on the vestibular sense. But what Nagarjuna is actually explaining in this chapter is not the senses as inner receptors. He's talking about seeing or looking and hearing or listening as action. That's the whole point. So by translating darshana as vision and manaḥ as the inner sense, they've shown they're not real explorers of what Nagarjuna was pointing to. To explore what Nagarjuna was really pointing to, you have to sit on the same zafu as Nagarjuna. That's where the exploration takes place. So I'm sorry, Sideris and Katsura, you've missed the whole point. And while we're talking about them missing the point, similarly, vyākhyātaṃ means, in their translation, explained, which according to the dictionary, that's perfectly good. But what it really means is that by means of the act of looking, the act of listening also is communicated in full. And the act of thinking up is communicated in full. So I've digressed from talking about Paul Medal. So one of the concepts that in his work and the work of Alfred Tomatis was what they call the listening posture. So to practice, I went on a workshop with Paul Medal he gave in Chester. This title was the Ear-Voice Connection Workshop. And this idea of a connection between the voice, the ear, and how you use yourself is really fundamental in Alexander's work. That was his starting point. And so in the course of that workshop, Paul Medal talked about the importance of what he called the listening posture. Of course, in Alexander terms, that's a bit of a red flag because the very concept of a posture tends to lead to fixing rather than thinking, rather than directing up. So in the course of that workshop, Paul Medal had everybody thinking about the listening posture. And of course, I could see all around me everybody sort of stiffening up. And Paul Medal was giving some sort of yoga type directions about breathing and so on. And it was all, in Alexander terms, it was all doing. So I could see the fault in it. So at break time, I approached him, poor old Paul Medal, so my ugly mug, ready to confront him on some subjects. He must have been somewhat, have his fear reflex startled. But anyway, I asked him, Paul, when you work with autistic children, do you ask them to do all this yoga breathing and, you know, do you ask them to have a good posture? He says, no, I don't. I said, surely just by getting them to listen, doesn't that cause them to have a good listening posture? And he paused for a second and pointed at me and said, that is pure tomatoes. See that? Because if you really listen, the act of listening communicates in full the act of thinking up. That's the point of that little story. And so I was quite happy that Paul Medal had affirmed that principle from his work. See, I said to him, let Alexander technique teachers take care of what a listening posture is in your terms. What you understand about is the listening side, the ear. You don't really know about posture, so you'd be better off not talking about it, as he does when he's teaching autistic children. So what he calls the listening posture, in Alexander terms, is letting the neck be free to let the head go forward and up, letting the back lengthen and widen while sending the knees forwards and away. So what Paul Medal calls a listening posture could equally be called a looking posture. And a looking posture and a listening posture are both, if you use the word posture, they're both a good sitting posture. But what people call a good sitting posture is actually more truly expressed, letting the neck be free, to let the head go forward and up, to let the back lengthen and widen, sending the knees forwards and away. So Alexander work is an exploration of what those words mean. And every Alexander lesson should give you a little bit more insight into what those words mean. So in a sense, the aim of a lesson is to see what those words mean. But therein lies the danger, because it's trying to see is not the same as the act of looking. The act of looking is free from tension of having the end in view, of seeing something. So this is something I've realised over 20 years of being in the Alexander work. Speaking of which, Walter Carrington famously said that after 20 years he was just beginning to understand some of the basic concepts. So in Alexander terms, 20 years he's not an awful lot. But one of the things you realise along the way is that it's when you stop trying that good things happen. So that, in that sense, it's the act of looking or the act of listening which is primary, without the anxiety of wanting to be the one who sees or the one who hears. And that's been my big stumbling block all along the way, because I've always been impatient, to be ahead of the game. So it's one of the things Marjorie Barlow criticised me for. The pupil should be one step behind the teacher, not one step ahead. And that was, again, one of the big problems I ran into with Nishijima Sensei, because what he wanted was, we were explorers together, but he was the guide leading the way. But then I kind of ran ahead and discovered for myself that he was leading us somewhat in the wrong direction. Then after that, everything went tits up. He, as a Japanese of his era, he couldn't really cope with a student who was telling me he was getting it wrong. So the way he rationalised it was that I'd gone over to the other side, back to Western white man's thinking. And the evidence for that was my attempts to explain here what is the meaning of manaḥ. So manaḥ, yes, it has to do with the so-called vestibular sense. But the truth is that there is no such thing as a vestibular sense as a thing unto itself. What's really important is the act of what? What is it, the vestibular sense? What action is the vestibular sense responsible for? What's it part of? If the vestibular sense is empty, then it's empty of itself, but it's full of what? Well, it's full of movement, it's full of balance. So manaḥ should be translated something like that. So the act of balancing, or the act of motor planning. That's what I think manaḥ means. It means thinking. So do you see that Sideris and Katsura translated the inner sense? I would have been happy with that 20 years ago when I first came to the Alexander technique. But as my understanding of what Alexander meant by thinking, as that understanding deepened, then I realised that that thinking is full of the vestibular sense, but there's no such thing as thinking as a thing in itself without the vestibular sense, and there's no such thing as a vestibular sense without the act of thinking. So that's why it's important in this verse to translate manaḥ as thinking. One should know that hearing, śravaṇaṃ, smelling, ghrāṇaṃ, tasting, rasanaṃ, touching, sparśanaṃ, and manaḥ, thinking, are communicated in full, vyākhyātaṃ. So each of those is nomina, singular, neuter, śravaṇaṃ, ghrāṇaṃ, rasanaṃ, sparśanaṃ, manaḥ. Listening, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking. Vyākhyātaṃ, that's nominative, singular, neuter. Each of those is communicated in full, as in verse 5. In verse 5, what's communicated in full is the practitioner, the listener, the smeller, the taster, the toucher, the thinker. But in this verse, it's the action which is communicated in full. And how is that action communicated? Darśanenaiva, just by the act of looking. Eva, emphatic, darśanena, instrumental singular of darshana. By means of darshana, which again, it could mean looking, it could mean seeing, it could mean realizing. That's for everybody to explore for themselves. So this translation is not by any means definitive. It's an exploration that's a basis for further discoveries. I had an email from James Cohen a couple of days ago, in which he noticed I told him that I'd start doing these YouTube videos, And he asked me, is there a book? And I replied, there are explorers who like, with their pick and shovel, to work in remote areas. And there are jewellers, Jundo, whose job it is to make the product appealing to customers. And nobody's ever accused me of being particularly user-friendly. Like when you used to have to, if I wrote a pamphlet for my students to attract, a marketing pamphlet to attract people to understand what the Alexander technique is, it was invariably no good at all, because I just ended up writing something that made me happy. That I expressed my understanding to my own satisfaction. But of course, a new pupil, it wasn't user friendly. It wasn't pitched at their level. So I'm not very good at that. I realised over the years, the Buddha said, practice according to your strengths and weaknesses. So I think I'm quite good at this kind of, what Nishijima Sensei called excavation, digging out the original meaning. And, in retrospect, I've always been happy doing that kind of work. But then it's been unfortunate in the sense that I discovered things along the way. And in that role, I being the seer, the one who knows, the discoverer, is not such a happy condition, Again, it's like chapter 3, verse 8, and shoveling horse manure to make a compost heap. In that situation, I am the looker. Go out into the garden and just look at it. It's beautiful. It's the act of looking. I'm not trying to see anything. It's funnily enough, though, in that act of looking, something is seen. Whereas when you're striving to see something and then you think you've seen it and you want to establish it, I'm speaking from experience, really, of why, although it's still up for exploration, it's not definitive, why it seems to me now that darśanenaiva is better translated as the act of looking in preference to the act of seeing. It has to do with practice being something really happy, that you're hitting the target, boom, like hitting the makiwara in karate, poof, poof, poof. It's very satisfying just doing something simple well. So that is what I'm suggesting, darśanenaiva, just by looking, just by the act of looking. So a true act of looking is done in what Paul Medal would call the looking posture. So the word posture is not good, but what it means really, a true act of looking is communicated in full by manaḥ, the act of thinking. So that a looking posture, listening posture, a tasting posture. If you think about it, if you were sitting at a table and someone presents you with a really delicious morsel of food, you wouldn't tend to relish it by being like a soldier on parade or by slumping like a sack of potatoes. If you really were truly tasting it, you'd be up. You wouldn't even have to think up. The vestibular system would do the thinking for you. Like when you really want to look at something, you don't have to make a conscious effort to look. You just poof, You know, think of teenage boys, you know, seeing their girlfriends without any clothes on for the first time. Boof, you know, that kind of looking is when my son, my older son, first arrived into the world. I was there to watch his head come out, and that's my first impression. He was looking. He came out looking. Don't think he necessarily saw anything, but he was looking. And when he was about 11 or 12, I guess maybe 10 or 11, maybe even younger, we went down the local cricket shop when he started getting interested in cricket, to buy him a cricket bat. And it was just a small sports shop, and of course he got the full attention of the owner of the shop. He'd seen lots of children coming like that to buy their first cricket bat, which is quite a big investment for a child of that age. And so he knew how to present a whole series of bats, and he was throwing the cricket ball. And again, my son's face, his eyes were as big as his face, and I thought it was exactly the same look as he had when he came out of the womb. And it's looking, it's being open. It's not. Trying to see is more a sort of a tense, focus state. See, Alexander again, he said, "Beware the devil at his concentration." When you're trying to see something, that kind of focus is not so. The act of looking is more an open. So again, the listening posture is open. Again, I've used the word posture, which is a dangerous word to use, but that's what Paul Medal, when he's talking about the listening posture, that's what he means. He means being open. And over the years, that's why I come and practice here, because I'm able to open my ear. Just the sound of the stream in the distance, the birds singing. I can't actually hear them very well in this greenhouse, but if I go and sit where I built my zazen cabin at the end of the garden, you've got a stream running by and birds singing and so on and so forth. Whereas when I lived in Aylesbury, I was always felt oppressed by light aircraft flying overhead, or sounds of traffic, but especially the aircraft, because it makes my ear couldn't cope with that. So you really want to be for zazen, a place where you're open to looking, because you love the forest, the sunshine, the trees around you, the garden, wherever. Somewhere where you can really enjoy looking without trying to see anything, and where you can open yourself to listening without being in a hurry to hear anything. One should know, jānīyāc. So that's third person singular optative of the verb jnā, as in prajna. Jnā means to know, to understand. So jānīyāc should be, maybe one should understand, might be better. Because again, knowing tends to be more black and white, doesn't it? You either know something or don't know it. Whereas understanding is something that we're out to deepen. We're out jānīyāc by cultivating. This is how ignorance is stopped, by cultivating just this understanding, jānīyāc, or by understanding of this, cultivating understanding of this. So now I come to comment on it. I'm going to change the translation from one should know, from one should understand. jānīyāc, one should understand that listening, śravaṇaṃ, smelling, ghrāṇaṃ, tasting, rasanaṃ, touching, sparśanaṃ, and thinking, manaḥ, are communicated in full, vyākhyātaṃ, by just looking, darśanenaiva. As also, that's cha at the end of the fourth pada, are the listener, chrotṛ, and that is with Sandy after jānīyāc becomes jānīyāc chrotṛ. The to be listened to is śrotavya, and then it's compounded with ka, which is added as a suffix to form adjectives, generally speaking, but sometimes it's added to nouns to express similarity. So the dictionary gives ashvaka, which means a bad horse or like a horse. So chrotṛ-śrotavyakādi means the to be listened and the like, but it's also compounded with adi, which means beginning with or etc. So chrotṛ-śrotavyakādi cha means as also are the listener, the to be listened to, and so on. So in the end, the listener as a thing unto myself is negated in this chapter. That's important to understand. That's really the main gist. The listener does not exist. I don't exist as a listener, as a thing unto myself. And the bird song, the to be listened to, doesn't exist as a thing unto itself. But that doesn't mean that they're not real. They're empty because they're real. They're real because they're empty. So there's an act of listening in which there is a listener, an empty listener, and there is empty bird song. And there's nothing better than that when there's an active listening going on, an empty dharma, which is listening, in which there's an empty listener and empty bird song, and the empty listener is in the empty listening posture. That's what I've been experiencing over 20 years living in France, and usually at least once a day I have that experience of, yeah, I'm in my element here. And so that is communicated in full, this verse says, darśanenaiva, just by the act of looking. So the act of looking is another word for sitting meditation. I humbly submit for your exploration.
vyākhyātaṃ śravaṇaṃ ghrāṇaṃ rasanaṃ sparśanaṃ manaḥ darśanenaiva jānīyāc chrotṛ-śrotavyakādi.